I think like this like technical PM space is one, and this like director type of space is one that I've been in for a while, and I really like to remain in that space. But I want to talk about documentation for a minute because it's so critical, and I think that it's something that you might take advantage, or you might ignore, I would say, as a more junior employee. I will say in tech. If you're following me, I'm assuming that you're in tech, and it's something that you kind of take advantage of, or you take for granted as a new employee, and a lot of senior employees take it for granted, and really they don't prioritize documentation as much, and everyone's days get busy. Work gets lost, processes are repeated, design workflows are duplicated, and a lot of that stuff, honestly, it wastes time. So I just wanted to go over like a few examples that might help you understand what I mean and why that is important. So I was having a conversation, actually it was yesterday, and I was trying to I was laughing with a friend because right now, in terms of like the face of tech, we were just really thinking about this like golden age of like being Black in tech and like what it meant and what the opportunities were. But we were really junior at that point. Like, we were just stepping on the scene. We had senior managers kind of like down our throats for so many things, right? Like, and we didn't really know like how to respond, like how to really have agency in the space. It was like the first time for all of us, and we were just finding like mentors and things like that. So a lot of that was really difficult. And there's so many things that I understand now about leadership, about working on a team, about company culture and mission, about like strategy, about documentation. And I guess we were both trying to synthesize how we could communicate that to the more junior people who are coming behind us and are thinking about where they fit and how they sort of can make space. And I was really thinking about this this week, just because there have been a lot of racial killings, right, in Colorado and in Atlanta. And I think I read some posts that kind of hinted at how difficult it has been for people to process the hate and the killings and the really racism, and still like function in their daily lives. And that is honestly something that I have struggled with for a while. And a part of that is like I haven't struggled through that silently. Like, I actually have a lot of documentation, right, that's like time-stamped, where I talked about those struggles, right, by like giving tech talks about those struggles, by writing articles about those struggles, by having conversations with other people about those struggles. That's documentation too, about certain company cultures that aren't really conducive to, I would say, like the generation as it is, and like the more like clubhouse rooms and stuff that I join, and the more youth that I speak to who are really interested in like social media and this like influencer culture, but they are kind of like lacking mastery in any like subject domain. But like I would just come back to this big idea around like documentation and how incredible really it is. Yeah, so I guess I will start with thinking about like my first my first software project ever, which was an internship project. It was my internship project at Intel. I've given a few tech talks about this project and that company and that experience. And I think like one of the most interesting things about that project was sort of like the lack of clarity around that project. Like there was someone, my manager, I think his title was he was like a product design manager or something, or a product designer, or I'm not really sure. I can't recall like what his place was on the team, but in terms of like project requirements, project like description, like product roadmap, like none of that it did not exist. And it was like my project was given to me, it was like a paragraph long, it was very ill-defined. There were like 4 sentences about the project. There was like I had my manager and I had one other we can call him like a stakeholder who was more of a domain expert. Like I definitely think this project might have been a lot more suited to him, but obviously that person didn't have the capacity to do it. So as a junior employee, I was like, okay, so I'm gonna do it. I was really excited to dive in, but every single thing was new. So one interesting thing I think today, in today's like ecosystem, a lot of people are thinking a lot more about the user design process, about project and product roadmaps, about accessibility, and so internship projects are much better designed. Like they're probably a little bit simpler to execute, but like I think where I was at that particular time, there was a real expectation for me to go through a design process to first design the project, right? So understand, I was working on a hardware team. I was a software engineer, so I don't really actually know anything about hardware. And one really large learning gap was to start to understand how the hardware was like playing in the data that was coming out of that hardware, and like where the data that was being collected, if we assume that it was being collected, where it could possibly be and what it could possibly look like. None of that was defined. And so one way to think about that into like today's terminology, like if you think about a robot and like sensors on robots, and like if you think about a let's say like a mobile robot, maybe like a car, right? Like a car might be like a really good example here. So if you have like an automobile, think about how many sensors are on an automobile, and like how much data is being collected about the way that those sensors interact with the world. Maybe if like those sensors like stop working, so there might be like moments in time when the sensors like stop collecting data. That's a lot of different data points coming from a lot of different pieces of hardware. And if you think about one like microprocessor that might be taking in like a lot of that data from like multiple sensors, and then thinking about like where in the like data ecosystem that data is being stored, right? And then trying to like aggregate all of that data. And then let's say so for my particular project, I had like a list of a list of different microprocessors. But the interesting thing that I was supposed to, that my product owner wanted to collect this data for, and each of those like microprocessors had a multitude of versions. So it could be like, microprocessor XDH, and it has versions like 0 through 26. And so he wants data for like all of those. And so throughout, if you think about that just scenario, as years change and there's like a new database administrator, because the company remains the same, like it's still like the microprocessor didn't like stop it didn't go out of service. It's just that the way that the data is actually being collected about that microprocessor's in the assembly line, when it's like being put together, like there are certain, like, I think it was like certain nodes or something that are being used in like the robots that are like building this microprocessor, and some of them like didn't need to be used like in order to like actually, you know, build the microprocessor. And so it would be useful to know that like you actually don't, like, this node doesn't turn on in order for in the process flow to build this microprocessor. So therefore you can actually like cut out that node in the like list of nodes that need to be used in order to create this microprocessor. So like, and also like if something changes from version 1 to like version 2, and maybe, yeah, like certain different nodes like don't need to be used in the process for the assembly of this microprocessor, then like we want to like take it out, right? And that data needs to be collected, and that data needs to like go somewhere and like go downstream so that you can like improve the process flow. So I'm vocally saying all of that, right? And for every microprocessor that's like in my domain of like, for my product owner, I need to track that somewhere. I need to track for every version the nodes that are being used and are not being used, and where that sensory data is coming from and where it's going. I need to track that somewhere. Now I'm just like, I can't even remember. I think at that time I had a notebook, and it was like this notebook was, it was a messy notebook, because every time I would have a meeting, I would just like try to write down everything that was being said. That would be an awful idea today. Today I would highly encourage you to bring some sort of recording device, so when you have a meeting with a stakeholder, you can record the meeting and then, you know, play the meeting back and take notes about whatever was said, so that, because there's certain like metadata, certain names, certain stakeholders, certain people that you might need to talk to, and you actually need to like remember those names and be able to go back to that information. So at the time though, you know, I think I did take a recording, so that was like cool. But there were just so many notes every single day, and the learning curve got faster and faster and faster. And I was an intern. This was my first internship. So, you know, that was interesting. And then one thing I realized is like I couldn't build anything, right? I couldn't build any like software pipelines to aggregate this data until I knew where the data was and like what it looks like. And in terms of like a company that makes microprocessors, that's like the whole company. So all of the data virtually is like about the microprocessor, like sensory data, right? So that basically creates like a whole landscape of like all the data. Like that's potentially the data that I'm looking for, could be anywhere. And so I went to go talk to, like, they had one database team at the time, and there was like one database administrator, database manager, who sort of like knew the data ecosystem. He understood like data warehousing and could give me a mental model of like, here's where things are, here's how things work, you know, here's what I'm assuming this looks like. And just, if you let me know like what you're looking for at a very high level, I can tell you where I believe you should go to find that data. And then you can check, you can try to validate that the data that I said was there is there, and that it's in the format that you want it to be in. No, that's something else. So it's like every assumption that I have, if I'm saying like, oh, you know, I'm looking for data XYZ, and, you know, I need it from January 1st through January 13th. And then my DBA says, okay, I'm assuming that that's in this table theta, right? And so then I go to table theta and I like check it out, and I look on all the rows in that table, and I'm trying to see like, okay, so is there some column or maybe a few columns that if I group them together, they might give me a cluster of data that would add up to the data that I'm looking for. Now, most commonly, the answer to that is no. And so I need to make a record somewhere of like what my assumption was, like the way that I described this data to the DBA, the way that the DBA came back to me, certain tables that he mentioned, columns that he mentioned, timestamps that he mentioned, conversions maybe that he mentioned. He might say like, oh, well, if you're looking for that data, it was actually recorded on these like, date sequences. So you need to do some sort of calibration to get the data back to that time. So you need to like make a note of all of that. Then actually go log on my computer on the DBA server and on like their SQLite server and go check and see, is the data actually there? How is it there from the time sequence that I need it? Is it in the format that I need it? If the answer is yes, then I can like make a note of that. I can add that to like my permanent documentation. I can take that back to my product owner and kind of say like, is this what you were looking for? Does this make sense? Is this what you asked for? And if I get a yes, then I'm like, great. So now I have like one data stream that I validated, that I found a pipeline for, and I can move on to the next one. But that usually going through that process was just for like one data stream, for one data feature, for one product in the product sequence. So that wasn't even for like multiple versions, it was just for one. But usually I could run a query on that table to like backdate it, to say like, hey, look back over the last 10 years to see if this same sort of query that I found, if it works for data running back 5 years. So I can maybe like get a list of all the versions that came out in those years and see if it's all the versions that I'm actually looking for in my like series of timestamps. And then any gaps, like maybe I noticed there are some years, some months that data just wasn't being collected. I need to like kind of try to figure out what happened. Like, did the server crash? I don't know, like what happened? So that there's like no data being collected, and make a written note of that, and then bring that back to the product owner to just record like, hey, so there's actually no data for this time period. And then beyond that, once I have like a query, like once I have all of the tables and the database tables and rows and like my like query defined, then I need to run that query, and there's going to be a lot of data that comes back. And so at that time, where I was in my computer science degree, and in my just like level of like data awareness and computer science fundamentals, like I didn't really understand things like data parallelism, like running multiple servers to power to run SQL, like big data processing basically wasn't something that like I was familiar with. I didn't know anything about like Spark or like Hadoop, like was it like Airflow now? There's so many tools now, but I had no idea what any of those tools were. So it was like when things crashed, I was just like, I don't know. I was just like, try to run it again, get as much data as I could, look at it, and then stop. And then I realized like, there's one particular time where my query was just running for a while. It was running for like 4 hours or so. It was a while. I can't remember. It was a long time though. And then it just like crashed, and I was like, what's going on? And like so many rows returned, but then it still crashed. So there were like way more to return. And I didn't know what the problem was. My product owner didn't really know what the problem was, but he recommended that I go talk to like a data scientist to like figure out what was going on with the data. And that's when I realized, so I described my entire like problem landscape, like, oh, I was trying to do this, I was trying to find the data, I went to go talk to the DBA, I found my tables, I think I constructed my query, but when I tried to run it, before it could like execute, before it could complete, it just timed out, everything crashed. And she was like, yeah, you just returned too much data, so you're gonna need to, you're gonna need to understand like some big data fundamentals. You're probably going to need to use like Spark, or I think at that time she was like, you need to use like Hadoop. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and she was like, okay. And kind of like she was, I just like looked up these terms, after we had the meeting. I didn't really know what she was talking about, but I just like took notes of some of the things that she said. So I just wrote down like Hadoop, Spark, big data. And then this is kind of the way that I approached really like learning on my own, because I would just teach myself things from the internet. So I went on YouTube, I was like, okay, big data, like Spark, like Hadoop, what is it, like how do I do it, what does it mean, like how do I run processes and things. I don't know how to do this. And so I found like some Coursera classes that there was like one, it was like a specialization at the time from UC San Diego on big data. And it just kind of like walks you through some of the like major areas of big data, like big data processing, MapReduce, like Hadoop, what it means, like certain tools that you can use to run big data processes. I will say like it's a very nice but also very dense course, and I think like the biggest thing I would take away from that project, like I feel like what I just described are like a bunch of gaps. And if I could start over, like I would honestly probably not have built anything during that internship. Like I was really antsy to like build things, right? And to like get to the point where I was like, I had something to show for like I had something to show with the project. But that actually wasn't the learning, right? Like in order for like, there was no way as like an intern with the time that I had, and even like the resources of the team at that time, like we needed a data engineer, and really like a senior data engineer to build that service. And we didn't have that. We had like some web developers on the team, and like web developers they can't really help you when it comes to like big data processing and ingestion and data engineering. Like web developers are not really helpful there. So like and for me, by like taking the time to go chat with that data scientist and understand what it was that I needed to be successful in this project, I was able to do more research and figure out what data engineering was, how data engineering like works, what it means to be like a data engineer, the tools, and really even understanding like the capacity, like the capacity that the company had at the time, and my team, like for my team, what was the capacity that my team had at that time. Now they're in the data ecosystem now, they have some like really cool conferences. I think Facebook sponsors a particular conference. It's called like Data 8, or it might be called like Data something, but they have like some of the best data engineers from like a lot of the largest companies, and they come together and they talk about like data tools and data services and like how to like the hottest things in like big data, right? But at the time there wasn't that. There was just like that Coursera course, those UC San Diego instructors who had really big ideas about big data and infrastructure, but like my company and my team didn't have like the tools and service and infrastructure set up. And I wasn't like some grad student in parallel processing and distributed systems. So I don't like, I actually wasn't that helpful, but at least I did get to a point in my project where I understood like the limitations of my project and could document that well enough to hand it over to someone more senior who was able to like go solve those problems. And especially like as an intern, the documentation there to like flesh out this project and to like understand the information that is available, to understand the data needs of that project, that is extremely valuable. It's very valuable to the senior person who's going to come behind me and who's going to have to like do that work and like answer those questions. And it might feel like mundane, and it might feel like it's not that important, and it might feel like silly almost, like you're not building anything, so it doesn't matter. But it does matter, and it's extremely important in terms of like project success. And I feel like in the future we will have more things known as like data designers, these like hybrid product data engineers. I know a lot of PM roles at this point are asking for people who have the skills in data analytics and are able to create like analytics charts that can run SQL queries and look into databases to actually understand, you know, what data is available, and in products can like understand metrics and like the way that users are using products, right? But that you actually need to be able to dig into a database to do that. So I'll also compare like that particular internship experience to like the work that I did with like Facebook, where Facebook, when you join that company, they have something known as like Data Camp. And when you go through Data Camp, it's like a 2-week like tools onboarding session where you go through a lot of tutorials. Like you learn how to use like the in-house tools, you learn how to it's basic. It's like a really big tools overhaul, because since the company is such like a big data company, they want everyone who's working in like the data ecosystem to be able to like utilize those tools to like get the information that is like needed to like do their job, right? And then in terms of like the data warehouse, every team virtually has like their own data warehouse, kind of like, I think they were called like workspaces or something. But like in order to get, like if you're working on like the group's product has, they collect data about the way that people are using groups, and there's so many metrics that can and are, you know, being collected. And so and if you think about the data that is being collected and really analyzed, there are data engineers, and those are just people who are like creating data clusters. So they're like clustering certain tables together and doing it, scheduling that to happen at like certain periods of time, and then producing those charts for like other analysts who are then like handing that over to like product managers and program managers to say like, oh, this makes sense, or like this does not make sense, or we think this is useful, or like maybe we don't, and things like that. So I think the biggest differences there are like the infrastructure, right? Like one company had like their data infrastructure set up, and they had tools and services and internal trainings to get everyone really, like I wasn't specifically a data engineer, but I went to Data Camp anyway to like learn the tools and services so that like I could, you know, create data pipelines and make like, you know, data visualizations to give to program managers to help them, you know, analyze data. Anyway, but the other company actually didn't have that infrastructure set up, and I did not have the like low level skills to build that infrastructure at scale, right? For that was a really, really large company. So yeah, like how do you do that? Like I don't know. I don't have like answers to that. That's a really big difference, right? And so when you're thinking about the way that your documentation and your processes might work at one company versus another, if you were doing virtually like the same project, it's very different because of the infrastructure available to you like at that company. I'll also just give one last example. So when I did an internship, I did a data science internship at this like financial tech startup, and the financial tech startup was just that. It's a startup, right? And I went from working at like Intuit, which is like it was a pretty big financial institution, right? Like they do like taxes, they also do like QuickBooks, and like Mint, and they have a lot of financial data. Like all of the major financial institutions give their data to Intuit to process. But this like financial tech startup that I was working with, they did not have data at the same magnitude, not even close. They didn't even have like a fraction of the data that like Intuit, for instance, has, right? And so in order for them to actually have a company, they had to like buy their data from this other company called Plaid, which sells like financial data so that like startups in the fintech world can build like financial models in order to like start companies, so that as users connect their banking products and platforms and services to their platform, they have like some infrastructure to build off of. Anyway, so with my project, I started this project started with virtually no project plan again. So I talked about this in the first project as well, but it did have sort of a direction. So I had like a pool of topic areas, like a cluster of topic areas that the data science team was interested in. And what I was able to do is like sort of pick one of those subject areas that like I was most interested in. So I picked like food. I want to understand the way that users are using their money on food. And so by analyzing the database of financial transactions that were in our warehouse that had a very high level of food. And so I'll say this: when you buy data from companies like Plaid, who are getting data from companies like Intuit, they have every transaction has like a label that's applied to it, and there are like a ton of algorithms that are already written internally for like the large companies like Intuit, where there's like some like high level that like gets applied to a transaction. So like let's say that you spend $5 at the gas station, like the concept of like a gas station is pretty known. So like wherever you go around the world, like every business has like a business category, and so that category might be like gas or like food, retail, some of them are just called like services, or it might be like automobile transactions. Let's see what else, what other types of, like a banking service, like there's like, now there's probably big ones for like streaming services or entertainment, but even within the food domain, there's like there's gas stations, there's like restaurants, there's grocery stores, there's meal kits and food delivery. And then I think there's like one or two others. I can't recall like what they are at this time. It's been a while since I worked on that. But it was a part of like my project was to start to like identify what are the subcategories for a particular transaction, and like how can you apply that metadata? Like, is there some, how can you like learn how to apply that label to a particular transaction given the metadata around the initial label and possibly like name and location? So what I did in this for this project, like the first step of the project was to take like a cluster of, I did about 5,000 different transactions in the food category, and I like had to go look up the company, like the company websites for like, because it will say like this transaction is from Lori Lane, Pennsylvania or something, right? And so I would have to go look up like, okay, so what is Lori Lane? Maybe Lori Lane is like a gas station chain in Pennsylvania or something. So I would have to like look up on the website, like read the website to kind of like figure out what it is, and then apply a metadata tag like to that one transaction. And I did that for like 5,000 transactions to try to get a sense of like, okay, so what does like a transaction that's like a, you know, coming from a grocery store look like maybe there's something about the name, or as you do more of them, you start to understand like the names of some of the like Kroger, for instance. Like Kroger is a chain that owns smaller chains in the middle America that are like grocery stores and or gas stations. So like you start to learn things like that, or you start to learn like some of the different names of like meal kits and food delivery services, or like, you know, maybe restaurants that like you weren't familiar with, and there's like tiers of restaurants, and like understanding what those are, right? And then, you know, you start to try to understand the different types of spenders. So maybe you have like one user, like in the database you have like a user, and like for a month, well, there's like every user has like, you know, infinite transactions since that customer became like a user, and you can see like, okay, so how much money has this person spent in the last week, in the last month, in the last year on gross or on food in general, right? So then you can see like who the high spenders are and put those people in a cluster. And if you have every transaction in that cluster labeled with like a metadata tag that's saying like this transaction is on meal kits, and this one is on groceries, and this one is on restaurants, then you can see like, okay, so yeah, Becky spent $10,000 on groceries last month, and she spent 80% of that at restaurants, and most of those were like 5-star restaurants, something like that. So you can be able to like tell that story, identify who customers like Becky are, and then make recommendations on how she could possibly improve her spending to fit her lifestyle. So it's trying to categorize Becky and create like a personality like chart, like a user story for Becky and her lifestyle, and target other users who are similar to Becky and make those same recommendations to them. But you do need to like create a sort of like user story for Becky first, and like understand how she's spending her money. So like in that project, I'm explaining it to you now, right? And how I went through this process of like understanding how to like categorize users virtually. But when I started the project, I didn't like know any of that. I didn't know anything about food, right? I didn't really know how to like label transactions, or like figure out, you know, how the transactions were coming down the fintech funnel. Like all of that is new information. And let's say there's like a new data science, like someone's going to take on this project after me, and like I'm the first person to work in this subdomain, so like they don't know any of that stuff either. And there actually needs to be like some document that's like explaining that And especially since I spent like hours and hours and hours hand labeling those transactions and then making it very clear of like how I came up with those subdomains, there should be some system or some way to like explain to the next person like what I found and like sort of like the inference that I was able to make after going through that process. And all of that, like the nuance of that story, that's something that actually needs to be documented as well. And so the last thing I will say, and I feel like I'm really learning this now, because when you're building something new, something that like doesn't exist, you have to start with like you just start to interview people to like understand what their pain points are and the way that they are solving problems right now. Like you're not even really coming with many assumptions. You're just like listening. You're listening and then you're like understanding. And a large part of that is like taking notes while you interview people, coming up with pretty good open-ended interview questions, and then like from those notes trying to understand, like creating stakeholder maps and like journey maps and like versions of stakeholder journey maps, like for particular stakeholders, like journey maps for particular stakeholders are really important, and kind of doing that process like over and over and over and over again and making more assumptions and like trying to explore like the ecosystem, so ecosystem maps, and understanding like who other players are in the space who are also like solving the problem, and like why is the solution that's currently on the market like not actually solving the problem for the person who had that pain point. Do they even know about this new service that exists, and like how could you build something that might like fill that gap for them? So those are all things that I kind of wanted to like start to break down now. And there's so many ways to like document that. Like currently right now, the major tools that I'm using are like Mural and like Otter AI. So when I have interviews, I use Otter AI to create audio recordings of the interview. And when I take notes initially the first time, most of the time I don't try to write down everything that the user said. I write down at a very high level like some theme that I noticed, or maybe some tool or product or website that they mentioned, or like a person's name who I should reach out to. I like write those things down, and then I go back and like listen to the audio recording and take much more detailed notes, so that while I'm actually having the conversation for the first time, I'm able to like really listen and like interact and ask like follow-up questions and like be very present like in the interview during the time that I'm like having this interview. And one of the things that I've actually noticed, which some of the designers, well, I only have one designer on my team, but one thing I feel that she does extremely well is take these like notes that are based on actual quotes coming from the interview, and like those quotes we use to make these like diagrams and pull out like themes from these interviews. And with those themes, then we can like pull out, like we can highlight pain points that we have identified our users are experiencing. And yeah, going through that process, like we've been doing this process for the last like 5 weeks. It's basically just doing that, having interviews, taking notes on the interviews, going through design sprints, creating like user journeys, not necessarily like user stories, but I do think that pulling out some user stories from that could potentially be interesting. But there's just so many pain points and so many tools and services that we realize are in the ecosystem but don't realize exactly how they work. So when I'm talking about like an ecosystem map right now, that's something that is still very like unfamiliar, and something that we need to unpack a bit more to figure out how we could possibly build something that would solve the problem that the users in this ecosystem currently have. So I know I chatted for a while, but I wanted to get all of that out. And I think what I've been doing is trying to draft blog posts that talk about these like high level ideas a bit more. But what I'm able to, by creating these like video blogs about it, then I can like go back and then like listen to the audio from these blog posts, and it I usually hear myself like saying something or describing some process that I didn't do a very good job of describing in words. So then I can go back and take out some of the information or the topic area that I pointed out but didn't go into detail on, and I have this like flowing list of like blog posts that I actually need to go into depth on and explain in written form and possibly create better content around. But I do think that this is like a pretty good start, and these are like very informal. I've been trying to do these like after I come back from my hike or like when I go on my hike, so that you can just like get an idea of like what I'm thinking. And I'm purposefully trying to make these like really informal so that you understand like the nuance and the like the in-between parts of the process, like how you actually get to the end point where and the way that like that's not actually like, it's not like clean, it's not perfect, it's not like extremely well, I mean the overall process is pretty well defined, but it's very iterative. There's still like a lot of questions. Like I definitely do not have all of the answers, and I just want that to be clear so that, you know, people don't think that like I do or like anyone does, because none of us do. So that was 50 minutes. I just sit here and talk forever. All right, so until next time.